I wasn't looking for the past that day. I was only looking for an old photograph, maybe a piece of my mother's handwriting. Something gentle, something that didn't hurt. But what I found was folded between 2 pages of her Bible. A single piece of paper, yellowed and fragile, like it had been breathing the same air for decades. 9 words. That's all it said. I didn't even finish the first line before my hands started shaking. It wasn't just what the note said. It was who had written it. A handwriting I'd buried half a lifetime ago. I sat down right there on the floor, the Bible open beside me, the paper trembling in my fingers. The world didn't feel the same after that. The house didn't sound the same. Even the silence seemed to change its shape. For 50 years, my family lived with one story, the story of my brother, the one who vanished without a trace. We learned to speak around his name, like it was a bruise that never healed. But those 9 words made me realize that maybe the person who disappeared wasn't the one we thought. I read the note again, and again, until the letters blurred into one long line that refused to stay still. I told myself it couldn't be true, that maybe I was too old to trust my eyes, but deep down, I knew. I had always known. 9 words. 9 words that would make me question everything I believed about my family, my past, and myself. And by the time you hear what they said, you'll understand why silence can destroy more than the truth ever could. I didn't tell anyone about the note that day. Not my daughter, not my neighbor who visits every Sunday, with her stories about the price of milk. It didn't feel like something I could share. It felt sacred or cursed. For days, the paper sat folded on my bedside table, its edges curling like it was alive, waiting for me to look again. Every time I passed by, I could almost hear it whisper. Not words, just a reminder. I'm still here. At night, I'd wake up to the sound of the old clock in the hallway, ticking like footsteps, walking away from me. And I'd think about him, about my brother Daniel, or at least, that's what I thought his name was. He vanished when I was 16. No goodbye, no letter, no reason. One morning he was just gone, his bed neatly made, his shoes lined up like he meant to come back. My mother told the neighbors he'd gone to work in another town. My father told me never to ask again. So, I didn't. You learn to live with missing pieces when the people who raised you pretend they're not missing. But silence has a sound of its own. It hums under the floorboards. It lingers behind old family photos. It breathes in the walls of every house that hides something, and ours was full of it. 50 years later, that silence came back for me, in the shape of a folded piece of paper. The morning after I found it, I went into the attic. Dust floated like ghosts in the sunlight, and every box I opened seemed to sigh. I was looking for proof, for something, anything, that could tell me who had written those 9 words, because even though I hadn't said it aloud, I already recognized the handwriting. It belonged to my mother. I could see her letters, the way she crossed her T like she was cutting through something painful. The way her Y curled like a question she never wanted to ask. I used to love her handwriting, until that morning. I sat there for hours, surrounded by her things, her letters, her recipes, her photographs, but nothing told me why she had written that note, or who it was meant for. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe it was never meant to be found. 3 days later, I found another piece of the puzzle, a photograph, tucked inside an old tin box. It was of my mother, standing beside a young boy. She was smiling, the kind of smile I never saw in real life. And the boy, he wasn't Daniel, he was someone else. I turned the photo over. There, in my mother's faded handwriting, were 4 words that stopped my breath. Summer, 1953. My real son. I dropped the photo. The edges of the world went quiet, because the date written on the back, that was a year before Daniel was born. The photograph haunted me. Every time I tried to close my eyes, it floated there in the dark. My mother's smile, that boy's face, and those 4 words bleeding through the paper. My real son. I told myself it had to be a mistake. Maybe she'd used the wrong word. Maybe it was a cousin, a neighbor's child. But the truth doesn't care what we hope for. It just waits. I started asking questions, first quietly, at the post office, at the church, at the nursing home, where the oldest people in town spent their afternoons remembering everything except their own birthdays. Most said they didn't remember a Daniel, a few said they did, but one woman, Mrs. Keller, looked at me a little too long before answering. "Oh dear," she whispered, "you're Margaret's daughter, aren't you?" I nodded, her eyes filled with something that looked like pity, or maybe guilt. She loved both of them. You know, that's what made it so hard. Both? I asked. She didn't reply, just turned away and crossed herself like she'd said too much. That night, I couldn't breathe. The walls of the house felt closer than ever. I went back to the bedside table, picked up the note again, and for the first time in days, I unfolded it. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it echo. 9 words. 50 years old, written in the same hand that made my school lunches and brushed my hair. I read it out loud, my voice barely a whisper. He's alive, Margaret, and he was never your brother. The air left my lungs. Alive. For half a century, I'd lived believing Daniel was gone, dead, missing, buried somewhere only God knew. But if he wasn't my brother, then who was he? My hands went numb. The note trembled between my fingers, and I felt something crack inside me, a soundless break, like old wood splitting in the cold. The next morning, I went back to Mrs. Keller. She didn't want to see me, but I stood on her porch until she opened the door. I showed her the note. She read it once, sighed, and said, "You were too young to remember, child. Your mother did what she thought was right." Right. I almost laughed. She lied to me my whole life. She nodded slowly. Maybe. But she also saved you. I didn't understand. Not yet. So she told me. The truth poured out in fragments. The kind you can't swallow all at once. Before I was born, my mother had another child, a boy, but he wasn't with my father. He belonged to someone else, someone dangerous. When that man found out she'd had a baby, he came for her. She fled, leaving the boy with a family in another town. Years later, she married my father. They had me, and then one day, the boy, now a teenager, showed up at her door. He didn't know who she was. She couldn't tell him, so she took him in and told everyone. He was my brother. I felt the room spin. The air was thick with ghosts and memories that weren't mine. So Daniel, the boy I grew up calling my brother, was actually my mother's first son, her secret, her shame, and mine without knowing it. But one question remained. If he was alive, where had he gone? Mrs. Keller said she didn't know, only that after an argument one night, my mother burned his clothes, told everyone he'd left town, and never spoke his name again. The lie became a habit, and the silence became a curse. I went home, sat at the kitchen table, and read the note again. Each word felt heavier now, soaked in everything I'd just learned. He's alive, Margaret, and he was never your brother. Alive, but where? For days, I didn't speak to anyone. I just sat by the window, staring at the hills where the road disappeared behind the trees, the same road Daniel had once walked down, never to return. The silence in the house was a living thing now. It breathed when I breathed, watched when I watched. I felt like a stranger in my own memories. How do you mourn a lie? Then one morning, I made a decision. If he was alive somewhere, I needed to find him. I didn't care how much time had passed, or how old I was. I owed it to the truth. I started with the local records, the dusty shelves in the county library that smelled like ghosts and rain. At first, there was nothing. But then I found it, a name, a man arrested in another town in 1974 for falsifying documents. The name was different, but the birthday, it was his. I followed every thread, every whisper. The trail led me to a nursing home 3 hours away, a quiet place, the kind of place where stories go to fade. The receptionist asked who I was visiting. I said the name he'd used, a false one. She nodded, pointed down the hallway. My heart was beating so fast, I thought I'd faint. The hallway felt endless. At the end of it, by a window, sat an old man, thin, his hands trembling slightly as he turned the pages of a worn-out book. I knew, before he looked up, the way his shoulders moved, the way his breath caught when he saw me. I knew. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then, in a voice soft and cracked, he said, "You look like her." I wanted to say 1,000 things, ask 1,000 questions, but all that came out was, "Why did you leave?" He smiled sadly. "Because she asked me to. She thought it was the only way to keep you safe." I didn't understand. He reached into his pocket, pulled out something folded, a piece of paper, worn and yellow, edges torn by time. "She gave me this before I left," he said, "if I ever came back, I should give it to you." My hands shook as I took it. Another note, smaller this time, and almost unreadable from age. 9 words again. "I'm sorry, my daughter. Forgive me for both of you. My knees gave out. He stood, slowly, and put a trembling hand on my shoulder. There were tears in his eyes, and in mine. I realized then what my mother had done. She had lied to protect us both, from the man who once threatened her, from a truth that could have ruined us all. Daniel, my half-brother, my mother's secret son, had been sent away to save my life. And the note I found, He1 hidden in her Bible, wasn't meant to hurt me. It was meant to lead me back to him. We sat together for hours that day. He told me about his life, the places he'd gone, the people he'd met, the silence he'd carried. When I left, he hugged me and said, "You were the only part of her that I missed." I drove home as the sun was setting, the sky painted in the same colors I remembered from childhood, gold and gray, light and shadow, truth and silence. That night, I placed both notes side by side on my table, 9 words each, 18 words that had taken me 50 years to understand. And as I blew out the candle before bed, I whispered, "I forgive you, Mama, for both of us." Sometimes, the truth doesn't destroy a family, silence does, and sometimes, the only way to find peace is to read the words that were never meant for your eyes.